Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. So today, Nick and I are going to be talking about a program of research that's been going on for about 15 years now, and speaking about a couple of VA-funded studies that we've done on end-of-shift handoffs. So we have nothing to disclose except I do have one thing to disclose, which is a first. This is the first time I've had a tie on in 9 months. We were away in France for 6 of those 9 months. So we have a team of about 15 people over the past number of years who have helped us with these projects, and we just wanted to recognize them. So our goals are to look at some of the underlying assumptions made about research in end-of-shift handoffs. And it follows nicely on the conversation that just took place about the human dimension and the technical dimensions of care. We want to differentiate between terms in anthropology called emic and etic. Consider variations that are resistant to standardization. The overwhelming focus to date has been on trying to standardize handoffs, but they are stubbornly resistant. And then appreciate the role and importance of complex adaptive systems in enacting handoffs, which is a highfalutin way of saying they're pretty complex. So we're going to structure our talk around 8 lessons that we've learned from our studies. And the first one is that context counts. And there has been an enormous amount of research focused on trying to standardize handoffs. It's been estimated that 80% of all adverse acts in the hospital setting can be traced back to breakdowns in communication during handoffs, 80%. And despite all of the research and interventions which have focused on standardization, things really haven't changed very much. And so that led us to think about some of the fundamental assumptions that are being made. And one of those assumptions is that a handoff is like, some of you may remember this word telegram. You might even have received one in your lifetime. More like an email. And that they're largely transactional. They're one-way communications. And our point of departure is to look on the other side, to look at that variation and embrace that variation and say that handoffs are an emergent property of any interactional system in which 2 or more human beings are interlocutors. So we've looked at physical, interpersonal, and temporal contexts of handoffs. Nick?
So the second lesson we'd like to bring out here is just this notion that handoff encounters are really governed by some social norms that govern any social phenomena. And so we want to make this distinction between what's known as an etic perspective and an emic perspective. So as Rich said, this comes from linguistics and anthropology. So the etic perspective more or less is this idea that we can observe a phenomenon. It's associated with being objective. So in the first handoff study that was funded, it was mostly focused on video recorded observations. So those are with residents in medicine and surgery, and then also with nursing handoffs. The focus there was looking at nonverbal communication in the context that affected these handoffs. And we noticed that there's distinct ways in which people hand off. There's something called a poker hand, when people would use handoff artifacts in a certain way. We also had a joint focus of attention, another way of modeling some of these behaviors. So you can learn quite a great deal from that perspective. An emic perspective is more associated with an insider view. What do people think about a phenomena? And so there's attention to ways of thinking or meaning. So we would call this an insider perspective. In the second study, we combined both of those perspectives together. And so we used video recorded observations, around 150 of these handoffs at 3 medical centers, but added in cognitive task interviews to really elicit, how do people think about these interactions? So just to bring this example home for a moment, some people may remember when Pepsi and Coke were jousting for who will have the greatest cola. Pepsi came up with a slogan, Pepsi brings you to life. Come alive, come alive. You're in the Pepsi generation. So that was based on an etic approach. This is going to work for marketing, and sales, went up in the United States. When this is translated to the East, to China, the translation came out as something like, this is a promise that the substance would reanimate your dead ancestors, right? Sales didn't go so well after that. So it kind of brings home this idea that this dual perspective is important. So just more specifically on the methods themselves, the third lesson was how triangulating evidence between these two, between video observations and interviews, helped us understand really what was going on in a more holistic way. And so in terms of, we looked at video recorded handoffs from these different services and did a micro-interactional analysis of these videos using videos and coding them, but also looking at the transcript. And so this fairly large team would look closely at these interactions, trying to understand what was going on, what were the interpersonal dynamics. And then within 24 hours, those residents were also interviewed about the handoff themselves. And this cognitive task interview approach, which is based on the critical incident approach more generally, asked people to walk me through the 4 or 5 steps that you do when you carry out a handoff. And in doing so, residents were able to talk about why they did or did not do certain behaviors within a handoff. They also talked about how the time of the year, July versus later in the year, or even the time of day, what they did right before the handoff and right after, how that affected the way they think about that. And so that helps us understand it in a more holistic way as well.
So as Nick said, our perspective is one of emergence, looking at the micro interaction between residents. And some of the things that we found when we took into account things that are otherwise invisible and don't appear in the literature are things like reputation. So if I know that Mike, for example, is a really strong resident, I'm going to adjust what I tell him and the way in which I tell him to my understanding of his strength. On the other hand, if Nick is a weak resident, I'm going to adjust the way in which I'm doing the handoff to Nick. That's based on reputation. There's no discussion of reputation in this literature because it's not something that you can easily see or appreciate. Nick mentioned the time of day. Handing off from the morning team, from the night team to the morning team is a different type of handoff than handing off from the day team to the night team. So if you're handing off from the day team to the night team, you want to give the information that's going to help the resident manage a patient overnight. You don't want that resident necessarily to make any critical decisions unless it's an emergent problem. On the other hand, handing off from night to day, you're handing off to the team that's going to be making a lot of clinical decisions. So time of day turns out to be important. Physical environment, there's lots about the physical environment, including interruptions, noise level, number of people in the room that affect handoffs. We know, for example, that in high acuity settings, interruptions are numerous. Pagers go off, overhead pages go off. People interrupt each other all the time. And about 1/3 of the time, whatever activity the person interrupted was doing doesn't get returned to after the interruption. And at least 20% of those are thought to be critical. And Nick mentioned constraints on time. If you're coming to the end of your shift, you're going to adjust the amount of time you take in giving the handoff. So we, as we've thought about this, we've thought about three kind of buckets in which handoffs take place. The first thing is preparing for the handoff. And we found that residents who are well prepared for handoffs have handoffs that are more useful to the receiver than residents who are still sort of completing the tasks on their shift. Then the enactment itself, how coherent is the handoff? How much of a narrative does the resident give the incoming resident? And then reflection. So, you know, I've handed off to Nick, but 20 minutes later, I'm driving home and I realize, oh my gosh, I forgot to tell Nick that this patient needs an X-ray at 2 a.m. So these are the three sort of big buckets that we've seen in handoffs. And then another concept that we've come to appreciate is something that we call interaction complexity. In the mechanical model of a handoff, it's one way. I give you a piece of information, you act on it, and that's that. But with interaction complexity, both the number of people and the number of ways in which the information gets transmitted from one person to the next counts. And this is the place where, okay. So I'll turn it back to you.
Handoff. So just playing off that idea of interaction complexity, really we looked at how residents would adapt to context and time in the course of their work. So the graphic up here shows you two different models of handoffs. So the one on your left side, a single handoff, is kind of the typical model that we found at two of the three hospitals. So the day teams are handing off to a night team intern, also known as a night float, and then that night float intern hands back off to the medicine day teams. And that might vary a little bit, but at these two hospitals, that was fairly standard. In some cases, though, we did notice that the night float may have a high number of patients. I think at one point, there was one night float that was handing up more than 70 patients to these day teams, right? And so the load and the ability to do this efficiently varied quite a bit. What we didn't discover at the second model here, the double handoff, was a model at a single hospital where there was a crossover or a double handoff that took place kind of late afternoon, early evening. They called it the evening handoff. So those teams would take patients for just a couple hours or less, and then hand off to the night team. Then those night teams, which rotated, would hand off back to the medicine day teams. So in terms of how do you advance care in these situations, what we notice is the residents do tailor their messages based on who they're handing off to. And especially with those evening double handoff teams, there was this real pressure to be not too brief, but not thorough enough. So we were concerned in some cases about the level of knowledge of the patients for that team. So there was greater uncertainty for those handoffs when someone said the second quote says, sometimes you send out to a person who's not going to take care of the patient overnight completely, or a double handoff. As you can imagine, there's the telephone type thing. Information can be lost.
And so we hope to be able to illustrate that. We asked Mike to write down a sentence, which I hope you wrote down. Okay, how far did it go? Just okay, so there were three handoffs. Can you give us the original sentence? Well, no, give us.
So a 65-year-old visits a clinic with a complaint of chest pain while hiking.
And Mike, what was the original?
Where the 65-year-old man was hiking in the woods, experienced chest pain, shortness of breath, and called his physician to ask for help.
So in the space of 3 iterations, you can see what information was lost. Some of it not critical, some of it might be quite critical. So this idea that it's just information transfer and nothing happens, you know, from God's lips to the next resident's ears really is not appropriate. So, so coming back to this, this issue of preparation and attention management, Nick mentioned that we studied some of the nonverbal behavior in the first study that we did. And we found that, and there's literature supporting that the best transfer of information occurs when people are face-to-face or shoulder-to-shoulder, and they're looking and their attention is focused on the same place. That would mean if I was handing off to Nick, that we had some document in front of us that we were both attending to. What we actually found was something that we called the poker hand, which is the resident who's handing off holds the document so that only she or he can see them, reads from that document to the incoming resident, who then becomes a scribe and writes down what's being said. And the problem with that is there's no way of knowing if the information that's being transferred is accurate and complete. So it's not an ideal way to hand off. And what we found was that that was by far the most frequent way in which handoffs were being done, from resident to resident in internal medicine, surgery, and nursing. We also found one that we call parallel play, where the people handing off might just as well have been sitting back to back rather than face to face. And that also is not a very efficient or effective way of transferring information. I already mentioned that poorly prepared residents, their discourse was fractured. The story that they told was much less coherent. There was much more reliance on the electronic medical record in the middle of handing off. They might self-interrupt and say, well, let me just double check on this lab value. And there was greater reliance on memory aids. And I've already talked about the distractions.
So the seventh lesson that we learned, we've alluded to it, but it's this idea of this concept of recipient design. So the perception of who you're handing off to or who's receiving the handoff matters a great deal. So just to give you this comes from sociolinguistics. And the idea is the ways in which people, and when they're talking in a conversation, you construct the message based on who you're sending that to. You orient and you're sensitive to that person, which is not something that you would see in a typical training program. And so some of the ways that people talked about that is people would make snap judgments about another resident's competence, for example, as in terms of, one example would be if you're not paying close attention. So these residents would say, if there's someone who I can really trust, I feel better. If it's someone a little bit less so, I give a lot of instruction. And so this would vary over time. What we noticed very infrequently was questions that were asked during the handoff interactions. And this was somewhat surprising. The quote here says, the sign out was more frustrating because I don't feel like they're giving me all the tools I need to safely take care of a patient. So we did hear the sentiment, but we, as I said, we infrequently heard that someone would ask during the interaction, could you explain more? Could you tell me what's going on? Usually there was typically no questions for any single patient that was handed off. And then these residents talked a lot about, in the beginning of their training, not really understanding this hidden language, some of the abbreviated discussions of what was going on in terms of patient care, but also the nonverbal communication that they had left feeling that they were learning on the job and hadn't really understood what they needed to do to carry out these transactions safely.
So I'll just add a little bit to what Nick just said. Or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just move on to storytelling. So I think one of the things that we found is that a person who tells a coherent story is much more understandable than a person who's giving raw facts. It used to be the National Board of Medical Examiners, for example, could ask questions that had no context whatsoever. They're just raw questions. And about 15 years ago, they transformed the exam to having a clinical stem. So all questions now actually have a context with them. If you think about that a little bit, we tend to remember through narrative. And so narrative, I think, is a good risk mitigating strategy and allows the interlocutor to ask questions. So this question about asking questions is an important one because the IOM actually recommended in its quality and safety recommendations that residents have the opportunity to ask questions. And as Nick said, what we found was that the incoming residents rarely asked questions. There's also a suggestion that at the beginning of a handoff that there's an opportunity to equilibrate. So, Steve, are you ready to take handoff? Steve may be coming from a 4th of July party, or, you know, his cat could have gotten run over. I was sorry to hear about that, by the way. And so an opportunity to be on the same page at the same time. So that's a recommendation that was made in hundreds and hundreds of handoffs that we've recorded and observed. We've never once seen that enacted. So some of the things that are recommended, we actually find absent in the doing. So stories also allow you to make anticipatory management judgments and contingency plans. So just to summarize, one approach to complexity is to try to standardize, and there's a lot of interest in trying to standardize processes and procedures, which may work if you're manufacturing a product, but works less well if you're interacting with another human being. And rather than trying to reduce variation, our point of view is to try to embrace variation and understand what it is, where it comes from, and how to work with it. And the problem of the problem of handoffs is really one of perspective, and the paradigmatic assumptions that have been made to date primarily focus on handoffs as a mechanical transfer of information rather than a complex adaptive system. So with that, we're done. We have about 5 minutes left for questions. Yeah.
Thanks for a really insightful talk. You know, I was thinking as you were talking about the narrative, but also when you were discussing the poker face kind of artifact use, whether you've seen any change with the electronic medical record as a new artifact that possibly is structured and affects the storytelling aspect, but maybe helps with memory or helps with asynchronous communication.
So that's a great question. Where we've seen it most is in our doctor-patient computer interaction work. And what we've found is that up to 80% of the time, the physician interacts with the computer screen, which is not available to the patient to see, 20% of the time interacting with the patient. Same thing is true in handoffs. If you're the only person who has access to the computer, it becomes a barrier rather than a tool that facilitates. But it's, I think, a great question, and would be a useful way of thinking about interventions that include the electronic medical record.
I would just say that people typically in these cases are using paper-based artifacts, and they're writing with different colors. They have their own notation style, and it is not standard in any way. They're sometimes referring to electronic health record, but at least in these interactions, it's mostly face-to-face with a paper and a pen, and that's kind of how they're carried out.
Steve, and then Mike.
So I'm also very intrigued by the importance that you've placed on narrative. And this is maybe just an observation, but I personally, and a number of physicians that I've spoken with, sort of struggle with the trying to capture structured data, and the narrative is so rich in conveying what's going on with the patient. And you touched on one thing, which is it facilitates sort of the if-then anticipatory instruction, but there are so many other things, including memory aids to remember which patient is which and how they got there, and your own thoughts about them. And I guess I'll just make the observation that I think this is a universal ongoing struggle between the benefits of having a highly structured environment, which in the Regenstrief, we're all used to sort of striving for that. Everything should be loin coded or go away, and this need for a narrative. And I don't know if you have any additional reflections about that, but I think it's a very broad topic that goes well beyond handoffs.
So because we're in a crunch for time, I would say, rather than thinking of it in either or terms, I would think of it in both and terms, that one can't exist usefully without the other. And there's a tendency within each of these worlds to say, it's all about the human dimension. No, it's all about the technical dimension. And what we really need is people talking to one another from across those two platforms. Mike?
Sorry, I mentioned, there's a lot of work that's been going on for years developing tools that connect to the electronic record that are designed for handoffs. You may have seen some of these in literature. They're not, narrative kind of tools, but more like presenting structured information that would complement the stories and help with the accuracy of data being handed one person. Some of that work was done right here in informatics, and I forget if it was Paul Dexter or Burke or somebody, fellows working on these projects. It was years ago, but there's still, I think, a big need for that kind of help with part of the process.
Other questions, concerns, criticisms? What do you think of my tie? I was a visiting professor at UC Santa Cruz back in the 1980s, and I won a prize for the best and only tie collection on campus. So thank you, guys.